Let us now learn about basal ganglia. Basal ganglia are actually a collection of grey matter within the central nervous system, and as such they are supposed to be known as basal nuclei, but they are rather popular as basal ganglia, so we will continue to use the same terminology in our videos as well. In this first video, let us learn about the various components of basal ganglia. By definition, basal ganglia are the subcortical nuclear masses found within the cerebral hemispheres, involved in control of goal-directed stereotyped motor activities. They are also involved in procedural learning, motor pattern selection, motivational aspects of behavior, and motor expression of emotions. Let us first find out what are the components of basal ganglia or basal nuclei. The main component is the corpus striatum. Now, corpus striatum is made up of an evolutionarily older part known as paleostriatum and more recent neostriatum, simply called as striatum. Both these paleostriatum and neostriatum are in turn made up of a larger dorsal part and a smaller ventral part. Now, these ventral parts are also recent inclusion to the components of basal ganglia. In case of paleostriatum, the dorsal part includes globus pallidus and ventral part includes ventral pallidum. These two parts are separated by transversely running fibers of anterior commissure. In case of striatum or neostriatum, dorsal part includes putamen and caudate nucleus, and ventral part or the ventral striatum includes nucleus accumbens and olfactory tubercle. Globus pallidus of the paleostriatum and putamen of the neostriatum are anatomically contiguous structures. That is, together they are known as lentiform nucleus. As per the traditional view, basal nuclei also included archistriatum, which is made up of amygdaloid nuclear complex, as well as claustrum. But as per our current understanding, amygdaloid nuclear complex is an integral part of the limbic system, and as far as claustrum is concerned, we still do not have a very clear understanding of its functions or its connections. So both these parts are now no more considered as parts of the basal nuclei. Instead, as per the recent view, the basal nuclei include subthalamic nucleus, which is part of the diencephalon, and substantia nigra, which is part of the midbrain. So when we consider these two parts as a part of the basal ganglia, mind you, our original definition as these are the subcortical nuclear masses found within the cerebral hemispheres, that will become wrong, because now a part of the basal ganglia is located in the diencephalon and another part is located within the midbrain, clearly outside the cerebral hemispheres. So let us first locate these parts in this coronal section of the cerebrum. Now, this is the body of the caudate nucleus located on the undersurface of the cavity of lateral ventricle. And this pinkish orange structure is the lentiform nucleus made up of larger, darker lateral part known as putamen and more medial, paler area known as globus pallidus, which is in turn divided into globus pallidus externum and globus pallidus internum. And below the thalamus, we are also seeing the subthalamic nucleus here. What we have not shown is the substantia nigra, which is part of the midbrain. Now, this is the horizontal section of the cerebrum showing head of the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. You will observe how the medial part of the medial aspect of the lentiform nucleus is related to anterior limb, genu, and posterior limb of the internal capsule. So let us find out the details of individual components of the basal ganglia. Let us begin with the caudate nucleus. What we are seeing here in blue color is the cavity of lateral ventricle. See how it has taken up the C-shaped curvature. Now, this is corresponding to the C-shaped curvature the cerebral hemisphere adopts during its intrauterine growth period. The central part or the body of the lateral ventricle will send 3 extensions to 3 adjacent lobes of the cerebral hemisphere: an anterior extension into the frontal lobe known as anterior horn, posterior extension into occipital lobe known as posterior horn, and an inferior extension into temporal lobe known as inferior horn. Now within this C-shaped curvature of the lateral ventricle, we find a mass of grey matter. Now that includes caudate nucleus as well as lentiform nucleus. We are seeing this caudate nucleus and lentiform nucleus from the lateral aspect. So the central portion, what we are seeing here, is marked as putamen, that is the lateral part of the lentiform nucleus. The rest of the C-shaped grey matter is the caudate nucleus. It takes that C-shaped curvature because it will be on the undersurface of the lateral ventricle. When the lateral ventricle turns to form a C-shaped curved structure, the caudate nucleus will also take a similar turn. It has three different parts. The anterior larger part is known as head. The head will continue backwards as body, and the body will taper down into the temporal lobe as the tail of the caudate nucleus. The caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus are elsewhere separated from each other by the fibers of internal capsule. But in the anterior-most part, on the ventral aspect, the head of the caudate nucleus is continuous with the putamen. Now that part is known as fundus striati. Below this fundus striati, there is a collection of grey matter. Now that is what is the ventral striatum, made up of nucleus accumbens as well as olfactory tubercle further below that. Tip of the tail of caudate nucleus is related to a collection of grey matter known as amygdaloid nuclear complex. Both this caudate nucleus as well as putamen, they are traversed by multiple bundles of thinly myelinated fibers known as Wilson's pencils. Now these bundles of white fibers is what is going to give it a striated appearance, therefore the name corpus striatum. Now coming to the relations of different parts of the caudate nucleus. Head of the caudate nucleus forms the floor of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle, and laterally it is related to anterior limb of the internal capsule. Body of the caudate nucleus will form the floor of the body of lateral ventricle. It is related to stria terminalis and thalamostriate vein medially, thalamus inferiorly, and lentiform nucleus laterally. Tail of the caudate nucleus will form the roof of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle. You are seeing that in the section here. And tip of the tail is related to amygdaloid nuclear complex. Now coming to the lentiform nucleus, as I said earlier, it is made up of a larger lateral part which is also darker in color known as putamen. Now this is actually the dorsal part of the neostriatum. And more medially it is made up of a paler area known as globus pallidus, that is the dorsal part of the paleostriatum. The globus pallidus is in turn made up of two parts, a globus pallidus externum and globus pallidus internum. So these three parts, that is putamen, globus pallidus externum and globus pallidus internum, are separated by two thin sheets of white matter known as internal medullary lamina and external medullary lamina. Now coming to the relations of lentiform nucleus. Above it is related to the fibers of corona radiata. Below, this lentiform nucleus is related to variety of structures from front to back. Anterior most part is related to anterior perforated substance below that. Further backwards, it is related to the transversely running fibers of anterior commissure. Now that is what is going to separate the globus pallidus above from the ventral pallidum below. Further behind that, it is related to amygdala, and posterior most part of the lentiform nucleus is related to sublentiform part of the internal capsule on its undersurface. Medially, the lentiform nucleus is related to anterior limb, genu and posterior limb of the internal capsule, and further medially it is related to caudate nucleus and thalamus. On the lateral aspect, the lentiform nucleus is related to claustrum, further laterally to the insular cortex. Between the lentiform nucleus and claustrum we have external capsule, and between the claustrum and insular cortex we have extreme capsule. This caudate nucleus and putamen are made up of two different types of neurons. 90% of these neurons are projection neurons, which are medium sized and they show spines on their surface, so they are known as medium sized spiny neurons, otherwise known as MSN. The remaining 10% neurons are the interneurons, which are either medium-sized non-spiny neurons or they are large neurons which may or may not be showing spines on the surface. Now coming to these projection neurons, which make up 90% of caudate nucleus and putamen, they are all inhibitory GABAergic neurons. They are further divided into two groups. Those which project to globus pallidus internum and substantia nigra pars reticulata, they are rich in substance P and dynorphin, and they express D1 type of receptor for dopamine on the surface. And the second subset of the GABAergic inhibitory projection neurons include those that project to globus pallidus externum. They are rich in enkephalin and they express D2 type of dopamine receptor on the surface. Now these two subsets have very different connections and very different functions. Coming to the next component of basal ganglia, that is the subthalamic nucleus, or otherwise known as body of lice. Now, as the name suggests, this nucleus is located below the thalamus. It's part of the subthalamus part of the diencephalon. It's an oval-shaped nucleus surrounded by white matter all around it. Laterally, it is related to the fibers of internal capsule. On the dorsal aspect, it is related to the fibers of fasciculus lenticularis. On its ventral aspect, it is related to all the input fibers as well as output fibers to the subthalamic nucleus itself. Its main input comes from globus pallidus externum. Output mainly is to globus pallidus internum, but partly also to globus pallidus externum. Now, all these fibers which are shown in green color, including both input and output fibers from the subthalamic nucleus, they form what is known as subthalamic fasciculus. Now, these fibers will be passing through the fibers of internal capsule. Now, coming to the substantia nigra, this was discussed in detail in our video on the midbrain, so you can refer back to that video again. It's an area which is darkly colored. From medial to lateral side, it extends from medial sulcus to lateral sulcus of the cerebral peduncle. From front to back, it extends from crus cerebri to the tegmentum part of the midbrain. From below upwards, it extends from pons to the subthalamic region of the diencephalon. The substantia nigra is made up of two parts, an anterior pars reticularis or pars reticulata, and a posterior portion which is made up of more compactly arranged cells known as pars compacta, and having a lateral extension known as pars lateralis. This pars reticularis has the fibers of the crus cerebri interspersed with the layer. Now, it is made up of iron-rich GABAergic neurons, whereas pars compacta is made up of darkly pigmented neuromelanin-rich neurons, which are dopaminergic, and they belong to A9 group. So, these are the various components of the basal ganglia. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this video. You can visit this site for other neuroanatomy videos.